Okay, in today's session, we are going to conclude Siman Reichad Beis that we've been on for a lot already. We're going to go through some of the chuvas from Rav Harfinis that he says that are very applicable on the Siman. So he opens up the Siman by saying if a person forgot, Shachar Bal Koire, the person who was learning from the Torah forgot, he was reading from the Torah, and he said Kaddish after leaning on Mincha. So does he return and say Kaddish um, before Shemona Esrei and Mincha again or not? So actually, before we even open this tshuva, if everyone recalls, so we actually touched upon this yesterday when we learned together the Piskei tshuvas over here in this exact question, and he said right over here that he would not say Kaddish again. Okay, that's the ruling of the Piskei Teshuvos. You would not say it again, even though we always say Kaddish before Shemona Esrei and Mincha. Nevertheless, you would not say it again, right? Typically, you're not supposed to say Kaddish after leaning on Mincha. So the question is, if a person made a mistake and said Kaddish, would you go back and say Kaddish before Shemona Esrei and Mincha or not? So according to the Piskei Teshuvos, you would not. You would not. Okay. The Nishma Shabbos says that you would say Kaddish again. So we're going to see that tshuva inside as to why you would. Basically, tshuva's in the footnote. He says, wait a second. According to us, that we say psukim in between, maybe you would be able to say kaddish, right? So the truth of the matter is that we already discussed this concept and said that the psukim that we say in between are not considered an interruption, but perhaps. Okay. Now, if you had an extenuating circumstance we learned yesterday and you had to relocate, then certainly you would say Kaddish in the next location. So let's see what the Nishma Shabbos says over here. So he says, if you interrupted with psukim, such as the Yahalu, etc., then you would say Kaddish again. Now, this is itself is a insight, this ruling, simply because of the fact that these aren't interruptions, as we learned many sessions ago. It's not considered an interruption. It's part of tefillah, and it's not an interruption. He says it's logical to say that since you interrupted by saying the Yahalu and the David Mizmor and Benucha Yoimer, even though that Lechachila preferably they didn't enact to say the Kaddish twice, once after laning and once before Shemona Esrei, because it's not a Hefsek Kavua, it's not a set interruption that was established by Chazal between the laning and Mincha, and since you need to say Kaddish before Shemona Esrei, right? Therefore, they allowed you to say the one Kaddish that will count for both of them, right? For the laning and the Shemona Esrei. However, in an occasional scenario in which person said Kaddish after laning, Lama Yavsid Milahasmech Amiras Kaddish Samach L'Tfilah Shemona Esrei. Why would you lose out now on not being able to have Kaddish right before Shemona Esrei as it's where it's supposed to be? Since at the end of the day, Kevin Shesov Kol Sov, according to our custom, you already interrupted when you said the Kaddish after laning, you had more than 3 psukim. Now, obviously, the rebuttal to this would be it's not considered an interruption, it's part of tefillah, that's what was enacted as we learned. Furthermore, according to the reason of the Lavush, that sometimes we say Kaddish only before Shemona Esrei and Mincha, in order that everyone knows that the Chazan already is ready to daven. Right? So according to that, you would say it again. Now, that itself is a questionable idea. You know, on a day like today, Rosh Chodesh, where the custom among many is, I would say, most shuls that I daven at, is to right before Masav. And then everyone takes off the tefillin. And then someone claps, and you start at the same time. Right? So you could do an easy clap also over there, right? So yeah. B'shamati k'be'eretz Yisrael yish makoyim shenohagin shemiyad achar gamar hagba galila yoyda shasel zenativ l'masku leimer kader. Okay, so he says, I heard that in Israel, in some places, immediately after Hagba and Galila, the Chazan goes down and he starts saying Kaddish very slowly. Okay, until in the meantime, while he's saying Kaddish, they're returning the Sefer to the Aron Kodesh.
Is that Lubavitch?
Right. This is what they do, and yeah, that's what he quotes in the continuation. This is what the Lubavitchers do. And then he said that yeah. So that's the idea, and right. This is the ruling, it seems like, of the Shaga Meir, according to Avu Dram. However, the Yabates doesn't seem to say that you would say Kaddish a second time because of Tircha de Tzibura. It's a burden on the congregation. So, look, you have different opinions what to do over here. I think that it's probably better not to, based on the small research that we did. But if you do say it again, there's what to rely on.
Well, if you're saying it right after Kriya, right?
Yeah.
It's still Hagban Glila. It's also Torah. It's also miscellaneous pasuk, I guess. They're saying it's part of the tefillah, so it's part of the tefillah. It shouldn't be considered miscellaneous pasuk.
Right, exactly. So the Zos Torah is only one pasuk. You need three psukim. So forget about Zos Torah. Okay. Let's say person reached the shul, okay, and he went there for mincha after they already laned. This isn't a great child. Okay, so he went to shul. He came in late. It happened. You come 4 minutes late. You miss the whole laning in certain
You
places.
got the time. You have last week's time instead of this week's time.
Yeah, whatever, exactly. So, are you obligated now to go to another shul in order to listen to the laning? That's like a classic question that no one really wants to know the answer to because they're afraid that they're gonna have to go to another shul. But he says you could be lenient, so don't worry about it. Now that doesn't mean that purposely a person could come late every single week and forget about the laning. It means occasionally if something happens, so then there's what to rely on that you don't need to go to another shul to hear the laning. So why? Well, this already touches upon something that we already discussed, which is that on Shabbos mincha, the laning is pretty much the most lenient of all lanings that we do. And it's not a full-fledged obligation on every individual. And it's a chova for the tzibur. Okay? Chovas tzibur. It's an obligation for the congregation that the congregation needs to strive to the best of the abilities to have a laning done and that they should hear it. But it's really primarily for the Yoshvi Karanas, who we learned before, who don't have time to attend the laning. They're on business trips on Monday and Thursday, so now we get them an extra laning on Shabbos. So they can listen to more Torah as discussed in the Gemara Baba Kama Pei Beis. Consequently, someone who was delayed, okay, to come to shul after they already heard from the Torah would not be obligated to go to another minyan in order to listen to the laning.
I guess it's easy for you to get the next. Let's say I don't know, but let's say it's a minion factory or whatever, right?
Yeah, look, if it's easy and it's right there, fine. But if it's a whole burden, obviously it's better to. It's better to, for sure. There's no question there. Especially if it's very convenient and there aren't so many minion factories on Shabbos Mincha. There really are.
I know, but
Right.
I'm just saying, let's say, for example, I could take a perfect example. Like there's a minion daf and then another mincha after the daf.
Right.
Let's say you come late to the first mincha.
Exactly. So best to do that. Correct. Right. That's one example. So the Magen Avram also says this over in the halachos of Kriyas HaTorah and Simin Kuf Mem Gimel. Shilas Jewish Divrei Yotzev talks about it. Okay, it's not as obligatory. Other practical differences that come out of this, but this is something to talk about.
He doesn't give you the case of saying Kriyas and Asher before Chatzos. I mean, before Mincha Gedolah time. We think he would have that.
He doesn't talk about the Shaila, and the reason is this is you have to know, not just know your audience, but you have to know your author. You have to know your author. You know, Rav Harfenis is a very big Talmid Chacham and Paisik and a Dayan in, if I'm not mistaken, Satmar in Brooklyn. And people learn his harm from all walks of life because he has very good questions, very good answers, very good practical ideas that sometimes aren't really discussed anywhere else. And but he's going to focus on what is involved with his community. So that's why he's jumping right into all these questions that come up around sunset. And they don't daven so early so
Right,
much. They're usually later in every department.
right.
So that's what he's going to be focusing on. And this is also a common theme. The next simon we're going to do after this simon Hashem is going to be Reish Adi Gimel, which is the halachos of Relavent Shabbos. And a lot of those halachos have to come into, okay, when does Shabbos end? All right. When the three stars emerge? When Seitach Uchavim? Rabbeinu Tam, Gaonim, which ties into Simon Reish Tabachal. And you look over there in his Chufas, he has dozens and dozens of pages on these different how late to end Shabbos, because that's what they focus on. So you got to know. So he's not talking about davening mincha too early, which I'm surprised because it's a nice discussion, but the truth of the matter is there's not that much on it. You have a Sitz Eliezer who made the Shiloh famous because he brought everything together very nicely. But really, if you look in the real estate of the Sfarim on this simon, you'll see that the Shaila isn't really discussed so much. That's why it's such a beautiful Shaila, and that's why when you tell people the Shaila, they really appreciate it because most people, your average person, would think, wait, no, it's only for mincha.
You would think it's not a big deal.
You think it's not a big deal. It's only for Shemona Esrei, or maybe Korbanos if you say before, but not the rest. And it's a surprise that no, it is for the whole thing, and it's a very relevant halacha, which is very applicable. So that's us, right? We are very careful. We daven mincha before sunset. So what's the halacha if you have limited time? Okay, you daven Shemona Esrei first. You can't finish everything before sunset. You daven Shemona Esrei first, or do you lane? The answer is you first daven Shemona Esrei and then you lane. Okay. The question is it permissible to lane after sunset? One could argue, this is the question the other way that we were just learning, not how early you could start, but how late could you go with the laning. One would argue, Kriyas HaTorah is Eina Chelek Mitzvos HaMincha. The laning has nothing to do with mincha itself. It was enacted to be said near the time of mincha. But it wouldn't make a difference if a person is davening or not. It means you could lay in the middle of nowhere, technically. It's just enacted to do near the time of mincha. So therefore, you could probably lane after sunset. And then he references that the Shalos Teshuvas Minchas Yitzchak in Chelik Vav Simin and Gimel says that a person is able to lane Vayachel immediately after Chatzos, halachic midday, before 6.5 halachic hours into the day, aka before the time of Mincha. And therefore, you see the Minchas Yitzchak seems to say that laning is not part of Mincha itself. Now, I think that this is a slight misquote because he only says that in a pressing situation. It's in Chelik Vav and Gimel. Yeah, Chelik Vav and Gimel. If we open our little handy dandy folder and we go to the Minchas Yitzchak, right? So this is the tshuva over here that he has. He only permits this in a pressing situation, right? Right over here. Ah. Efshel likris b'torah lahafshir boitza chotzi shor shachar chatzos v'tzilas mincha yizbalu b'shishu mechsa. Kinyer lefini staiti. So he only says pressing situation. So I think that's questionable. He says this can be done in a pressing situation. So that's definitely something to think about. When you go through something in a very ooh, this purple color's got to be changed later. He says that look, what do we usually do blue? I think that's our minhag over here. Okay, blue. So we usually say that that this could only be done. When you learn something in depth like this, I'm gonna default the blue. When you learn something in depth like this, then you realize, okay, this is missing, that's missing. I remember someone once said, when you really know something well and research something, so you understand the nuances of when people make up. The average person, it sounds good, it looks good, it's perfect, it's amazing. But for someone who understands what's going on, you say it's great and everything, but this is missing. Same thing with anything in life. Take that with anything. Person, uh, you know, he hears a good chazan daven. And he himself is a decent chazan himself. He appreciates he's a good chazan. Person, for example, if we would meet an amazing artist and see an amazing picture that's worth a couple $1 million, we'd say it's not. I'm saying like
We don't appreciate
I
it.
wouldn't pay more than 100 for it, right? Maybe 50 even, right? But for other people, it's a whole thing, and they could look at that picture for hours and analyze each detail. So it's like that with anything. It's like that with anything in life. So it's the same thing, you know. Mela, someone who regularly davens mincha before sunset, that's us again. And right now he delayed. Okay. He delayed and it's near the time of sunset. So he should daven Shemona Esrei first. And then after Shemona Esrei, he should lane. Okay. Shemona Esrei comes first. This is also a surprising ruling for the average person who did very minimal research on the halachos of mincha because they would think you're messing up the order. Laning comes first. But no, it doesn't. Says the Sefer Makor Chaim, says he found that if it's a pressing situation, you would daven mincha first, afterwards lane. That's his Kabbalah. He has a sort of tradition on this. In the Yeshua Avram, the Butchacher, he seems to say that if you daven first, you should not lane after mincha. Because the time to lane is specifically before you say Shemona Esrei mincha.
That's the way it is.
What?
That's the way it
Yeah,
is.
that's the way it
That's the way
is.
they're not getting it.
Right? Just like you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. Oh, here he touches upon that, Shiloh. Just like you wouldn't fulfill your obligation of laning at mincha before you daven musaf, which is interesting. He's not putting that time that we said together, but he's comparing the two. Right? You can't do it in the wrong time. The time for laning is before Shemona Esrei Mincha, and furthermore, you would not fulfill your obligation of laning, Mincha laning before Musaf. Interesting, he says before Musaf, really after Musaf, before 6.5 halachic hours. But okay. Nevertheless, many Achronim, including the Maharil, says that you would in fact fulfill your obligation and you could be lenient. If you have some individuals, for example, who didn't hear the laning, they could do it. And therefore, in this situation, you would Taven Shemona Esrei first and then lane after. You have the Maharil to rely on the Chavos Yair. Therefore, this is a insightful tshuva in and of itself. the end of the time of mincha is approaching. Okay, and there's not enough time to read from the Torah and to daven mincha. What's better? I mean, this is similar to the Shiloh 4. You daven mincha first.
You just can.
But the reason why this is different is because even if you're going to completely lose the laning, and by mincha Shemona Esrei, you could say you can make it up. You have a tashlumin based on the Magen Avram and Hilchos Kriyas Torah and Kuf Mem Gimel, quoting the Maharam Lublin. Laning on Shabbos and mincha is not an obligation, a very big obligation, because of the Yoshvi Koronos, as we saw. Sefer Zachor Lavram says one time on Shabbos it happened that it was near the time of sunset. They skip the laning, they begin Shemona Esrei. That's because in Israel they try to daven before Shkia, fine. So the Imad Bracha actually is unsure what the halach will be in this case because mincha you could make up tashlim and laning you can't. And mincha is better because laning on Shabbos isn't as obligatory from the Yoshvi Kronos, so he doubts that. But he comes out and saying if you only have time to do one, then you would actually daven Shemona Esrei. It's interesting also to note the language of this question. Sosman Tilas Mincha. I didn't say what the Sosman is exactly.
Right.
But whatever you hold the last time daven mincha is,
There was an interesting point
it'll be
about
this.
that in Eretz Yisrael, but
Yes.
these the Satmar Hasidim that they try to daven mincha before our shkia, not the shkia.
It seems like right over here on this line.
I'm guessing
You got to be careful. The
because
shkia, the bein hashmasha is much quicker over
right,
there.
that's what I was about to say. Right. So that must be it.
Right.
But they don't have that leeway.
Correct. And he has a few more tshuvas over here. First of all, regarding learning between shkia and seisel chuchavim. Okay. What does it mean you don't want to learn with a chavrusa then? That means shelo lidrish berabim. You don't give a whole drasha then, a whole public shir, not within the context of shalashudas. So, we'll discuss about that one.
We
He
don't.
says you already see.
So go ahead.
No.
I'm gonna say, but we don't hold from this. I mean, I've seen, big rabbeim, they give a shir mamish between mincha and
Okay, so,
ma'ariv.
okay, so
They
look at
typically have shalshudas beforehand.
all right. So look at this over here. Here they talk about you see the custom is during shalashudas to be lenient.
That's if they having shalshudas, they're shalshudas.
Yeah, I don't know about establishing an official shir between Mincha and Ma'ariv. I think it's questionable.
Because some people they make a Pirkei Avos shir like 20 minutes before ma'ariv,
Yeah, I know. That's because Pirkei Avos maybe could be different. Pirkei Avos maybe could be different. Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, because it's the custom is to do Pirkei Avos, so maybe you could be more lenient there.
But in Mamish is an Indian nowadays also that you should not have a shir between mincha and ma'ariv.
Yeah, what changed? He says otherwise.
We haven't seen anything,
He says otherwise. This is, I think, our ninth session, each averaging around 35 minutes. And we haven't seen.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, but we said a person can learn b'yichid, this person can
For sure you could. So, trying to think what we missed from Mincha that we didn't discuss. I mean, that's basically a wrap, off the top of my head. Before we start the official review, we went from top to bottom. We went from Ashrei. Shouldn't say it before. Ashrei we always say before Mincha anyways. K'dei la'amod tefillah mitoch divrei Torah. Don't just jump into Shemona Esrei. We discussed many reasons why we say Uval Latzion. When else do we say Uval Latzion during Mincha? Uval Latzion we usually only say in Shabbos. Morning. So we have a discussion about that. Many answers for that. Discussed that you shouldn't be starting Ashrei and Novelitzion before the time of Mincha, 6.5 halachic hours into the day. We discussed the significance behind the pasuk of Anis Filasi, perhaps one of the most underrated parts of all of Shabbos. People don't really know much about the pasuk, why we do it, what the significance is. We discussed laning. Any of the halachos about laning also shouldn't be done before we discuss Anis Filasi. Could it be done sitting, standing? Whole discussion. Usually stand for it. Uh, could you say it before the Aron Kodesh is open or
It's
not?
better to say it after the Yom Kippur.
That's right. That's right. Very good. We discussed the laning, why we do it, how early you could do it, how late you could do it. Um, Significance behind the Kaddish after laning, or their lack of. We discussed talus. We wear a talus or not for laning. We discussed by laning.
It's a cover of Torah, right?
That's right. It's one of the reasons. Why is there no Kaddish after? It's not interruption. We had a lot of discussion on why it wasn't interruption, which isn't going to make it into the summary notes. But we discussed that. That was beautiful. Because seemingly it would be interruptions. We have full paragraphs that we say after. And we discussed the Kaddish there, the Shemona Esrei. We touched upon, at least in the Torah, if someone said a weekday Shemona Esrei accidentally, and they already finished davening, or if they didn't daven at all, would they do tashlumin on that Shemona Esrei after Shabbos? If they remembered after Shabbos, because now their Shemona Esrei is going to be a weekday Shemona Esrei, and they already davened the weekday Shemona Esrei. What will that accomplish? Discuss that. Major discussion about that. We discussed after Shemona Esrei, Sidkas Chosedek and Kaddish. We typically say Sidkas Chosedek first. We discussed when you would say it, when you wouldn't say it. We discussed if a person messed up and accidentally went straight to Kaddish. And he said the first four words. You say Sidkas Chosedek afterwards. A lot of people don't know that halacha.
Would that be the same thing like Tachna? Let's say you should be saying Tachna that day, and the guy said Kaddish. Because he thought whatever the reason.
Right. Right. So we're gonna have to see in Hilchos Tachnun if you would say Kaddish after, you probably would. If you would say Tachnun after, you probably would. But we're gonna say we're gonna have to confirm that.
And then one other question.
Yeah.
We said right by these philosophies, you should say after the Torah is open, right?
Yeah.
What do we consider the psukkah of Kel Erech Apayim? Like are those also should be, but those like it seems like you're supposed to say before.
We didn't come across that because we don't do that at Mincha.
Right, no, I understand that. I'm just saying.
So we're gonna so after we learn Siman Reish Adi Gimel, which is Siman after this, which is Ma'ariv. We're probably going to do Reish Samach Aleph. After we do Reish Samach Aleph, or maybe even before Reish Samach Aleph, we're going to learn about Musaf. And we're going to learn also about laning on Shabbos. So we're going to cover all that there. All that. And we're going to go through it slowly. We're going to understand it. There's very few people who know those halachas as well. I mean, a gabbai should theoretically know them. Look, these halachas are out of the system. There's two types of people. You have the balabatim who are learning the Daf Yomi, they're learning Gemara, and then you have the rabbis who are they're learning what's in the system. They're learning Bishul, they're learning Basa B'chalov, they're learning a little bit of Aveilus. They're not learning this. So this is out of the system what we're doing. That doesn't mean that it's not important. It means that it's a forsaken area of Torah, and we're going to get schar for all the people who don't learn it and Siyat Dishmaya. That's what it means. We'll go through it. It's a little more boring, perhaps you could say, but when you learn it properly, it's interesting. So we discussed the Kaddish over there. Sidkascha, if there's a chassan who's getting married, that night, there's even a discussion if you would say Tachnan. If you have a chassan getting married tonight, the next day, probably still say Tachnan at Mincha. So you still say Sidkascha. So even though it's an Ofruf, you would still say Sidkascha. If it's a Sheva brachos, then you wouldn't. Right? So that's the difference. So we learned in depth about all the different cases, and there's certain cases which are actually machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, which would obviously have a practical difference on the Sephardim and Ashkenazim, as when to say it or not. So we discussed the Sid Additionally, we um, yeah, we discussed that, and then Aleinu, we discussed a little bit by Kiddush Levana, and we didn't really discuss that so much. But and every tefillah ends with Aleinu. Discussed that actually a little bit by Sfira also. Aleinu, we had that whole Torah over there. But so that's basically the simon, and we're gonna do the next day or two. Takes more than a day. I don't care. I'm not in a rush. You ain't gonna rush me. And so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a review. It's around 10, 11 pages, typed up font 12 in Word, you know. And that's the story.
Okay.
It's very funny today and yesterday. I davened at two different minyanim. In both, they asked me to do halal. They had an ovel at each minyan. He davened everything except for halal. And then they asked me to do musaf. And yesterday gave me a lead, today they didn't. Whatever, it's all good. I don't need the
They
lead.
don't let the other do this either.
I don't know. You didn't do it, whatever.
Uh-huh.
So
I guess
today, so he's trying to speed me up. Okay, it's a little bit of an earlier, faster minute. I'm thinking, don't ask me to daven
right.
if you can ask me to speed up. I'm doing you a favor. Either you could get up there or you could find some. All right, anyways. All right, so tomorrow we will continue
Okay.
meditation.
All right.
All
Have a
right.
great day.
Good
Thanks a lot.
luck,